Unlike the original run of Doctor Who, the modern era deemed New Who put much more of an emphasis on the relationships of the companions. Indeed, whether it was a boyfriend or a parent, a companion always had some kind of tether back to the real world. Even when Stephen Moffat became showrunner, this aspect would remain with Amy Pond's hapless boyfriend Rory Williams. After being introduced in the 11th hour, the pair's relationship and impending wedding would become a significant part of Series 5. In order to create Rory's first adventure in the TARDIS, Moffat turned to writer Toby Whithouse, who had previously contributed the acclaimed School Reunion for the main show and the divisive Greek-sparing Gifts for the Torchwood spin-off. With the brief being a romantic narrative set anywhere in the world that was a romantic setting, Whithouse settled on the city of Venice, also believing that vampires would fit the setting perfectly for some reason. This combination led to the aptly titled Vampires of Venice, which is pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. The Doctor taking Amy and Roy for a romantic getaway only to come face to face with the titular vampires, who are also weird fish from space. You know, as you do. Vampires of Venice is one of those Doctor Who episodes with a bit of a weak reputation, often considered mediocre. So why is it perceived this way, and might it actually be underrated? Well, put down your Lady D fanfiction and jump into a vampire fish canal, because it's time to review Series 5's Vampires of Venice.
Let's see how special you are.
Step on me. As we all know, during the controversial final scene of Flesh and Stone, Amy sexually assaulted the Doctor, despite being on track to marry her Giga Chad fiance Rory the next day. I guess that's definitely one way to spend your Hindu. Not sure what the police would think about that though. There was actually a Meanwhile in the TARDIS minisode set between these two episodes, which is important for showing how the Doctor talks her down from her horniness. Yes, to Amy's shock, it turns out the Doctor doesn't actually want to bonk her, because she's simply another in a long line of companions. So basically, he friend-zones her. Ouch. I think it's a good piece of context for Vampires of Venice, explaining how and why the Doctor wants to bring Rory along, although the beginning of the actual episode does go through it again, just so you understand the framing. I do like this part of the episode. It sets it up as a date for Amy and Rory to try and keep their relationship afloat after the Doctor saw how quickly Amy was drifting. After everything that went wrong with Rose and Mickey, it would make a lot of sense that the Doctor wouldn't want to let yet another relationship crumble because of him. I think it shows some good character growth and maturity, because he clearly still feels responsible for barging into that relationship all those years ago. However, what isn't very mature of him is bursting out of a stripper cake and bragging about Amy kissing him. It's such a weird scene, making Rory look like a clingy dork and the Doctor look like a completely unsympathetic twat. I know a big part of the 11th Doctor's character was being socially awkward, but he's just very unlikable in this episode, with this specific instance continuing the ill-informed choice of making that sexual assault plot point comedic. And then it just cuts to the title? It's the weirdest end to a cold open I've ever seen. Like they wanted the Vampire School to be the whole cold open, but couldn't find a way to integrate the stag do scene into the main episode. So they just kind of dumped it into the cold open as well. It feels very tacked on and strange, making it quite a jarring and weirdly edited opening to the episode. Speaking of the Vampire School, vampires have always been a cornerstone monster in legend. Tales of immortal creatures roaming the night hunting for blood have captured the imaginations of storytellers throughout history. Of course, in the modern day Western media, there are two main types of humanoid vampires. Well, unless you count energy vampires.
This is my office, also known as the hunting ground.
You get the hideous, more animalistic monsters on one side, and then on the other, you get sexy vampires.
So we finally...
Step on me. And to be honest, nothing quite captures the zeitgeist around the early 2010s like sexy vampires, mainly because of the affront to humanity that is Twilight. Therefore, it's no surprise that Doctor Who decided to tell a story with lots of attractive vampires around this time, because it was the cool thing to do. I mean, sure, it looks good and I like the effect of the teeth, but what I hate about it is that all these vampires are actually weird fish alien creatures. It's definitely an inventive idea, but I hate it because Doctor Who has had vampires before, multiple times. State of Decay has your traditional standard aristocratic vampires and works well, but here they instead decide to have fish. Because Venice, I guess? It feels short-sighted and a missed opportunity to bring back the great vampires from that earlier story, especially since they, like the Rachnos, were ancient enemies of the Time Lords. Or failing that, just make the vampires plasmavores or something else already familiar to fans. But no, instead you get weirdly borderline incestuous fish aliens trying to find girlfriends. It's bizarre. But hey, at least there's that fun scene with a mirror.
Pale, creepy girls who don't like sunlight.
Sounds like my kind of woman. Indeed, the vampires supposedly can't stand out in sunlight because they get burned, but this is insultingly inconsistent within the episode. Seconds after Isabella fails to escape because of the sunlight, she gets sentenced to death in the water despite being out in broad daylight. How did nobody notice this? All the other girls in the scene have to protect themselves from the light, but apparently not Isabella? It's horrific, failing to maintain even a basic level of continuity. Is it really too much to ask for something this simple to be consistent? But hey, look at the bubbly piranha water, just ignore the episode being leakier than a boat made out of fishnets. Nothing to see here, just move along. Even the school aspect doesn't make a lot of sense. People seem to be drawn to it because of money, since somehow you get paid for sending your daughter there or something. But how did the Calvieri school build such a good reputation? If nobody ever comes out, why do people keep sending their daughters in there and then act surprised when they don't see them anymore? It makes no sense and only feels like it's there to explain how Rosanna is taking the women. But we're never even given the slightest fake out illusion of them actually learning anything. This episode could have been a really creepy and psychological Suspiria-like narrative, where Amy finds herself enrolled in this unusual school where something alien is happening. That could have been very suspenseful, but what we actually get is this very boring and typical Doctor Who narrative. Yay. Yes, the conniving Signora Rosanna Calvieri is enlisting the young women of Venice to become unwilling vampire brides for fish monsters in the water. Look, it's like an incel's wet dream. With a story like this, it's important to have a personal link to the events, which takes the form of Guido, a father who has recently lost his daughter to the school. However, he is another example of things being weirdly written in this episode. He initially serves that role of being an on-the-ground perspective of the events surrounding the mysterious school, but as soon as the episode doesn't need him anymore, he just gets blown up and the Doctor literally turns it into a joke.
It's all you make people a danger to themselves, and the next it's we're not leaving you, but if one of you gets squashed or blown up or eaten...
We never get to see his reaction to Isabella dying. It never even gets mentioned. And when Guido himself dies, he gets completely forgotten about. All these two characters are therefore to be convenient plot devices furthering the narrative rather than being actual characters. Like, oh look, Guido can get them into the school. Oh look, Isabella helps Amy escape. That's literally all they're there for. They don't feel like people. So it's hard to connect with them on a human level or feel anything for them. They just exist. And when the story no longer needs them, they're discarded unceremoniously and completely forgotten about. I feel like another big problem with this story is how it completely bungles the villain's motivation. Rosanna fled her home planet because of the cracks in time and the silence, which ultimately claimed her planet and her people, so she's desperately trying to restart an entire civilization, otherwise her whole race goes extinct. That sounds like something the Doctor would relate to, since he too is the last of his kind and might sympathise with her plight. But nope, instead they make it a sex joke.
You're a big fish. Think of the children.
Now, obviously, turning people into alien fish vampires against their will is a bad thing to do, and the Doctor shouldn't condone it. But the problem stems from the fact that Whithouse doesn't even have the Doctor offer to take them to another planet where they can do this without hurting people. Remember, this is the same character who gave the Daleks and Cybermen this offer, but apparently vampiric fish aliens are a step too far and deserve genocide simply because Rosanna didn't know Isabella's name. It's just mind-boggling, and unintentionally makes the Doctor look way more ruthless than it intends to. I can't help but feel like this episode would be greatly improved if the Doctor faced some kind of dilemma like Fires of Pompeii. He has to choose between saving this race or condemning them to extinction. It's a weighty thing to face, something that was often a big and dramatic plot point in the Davis era. But here there's no nuance to it, no argument or crisis to be had. It's just fish vampires bad, with absolutely no sympathy built up for them or their desperation to survive. It just ends up making the episode predictable and tedious, without the kind of layers that made even the beast below the slightest bit interesting. But hey, at least this scene gives you the question: would you still bonk a vampire lady if you knew she was actually a giant gross fish monster underneath? I'll leave that to you in the comments. An important part of any historical episode is realising the setting well, and I do like the look of Venice in this episode. Even if it wasn't filmed in Italy itself like the Fires of Pompeii, Croatia's city of Trugir is a good looking alternative, because it was part of the Venetian Republic for nearly 400 years, so the architecture is suitably similar to Venice itself and passes for the real thing. The period costumes also provide an authentic feeling, so it's a great example of Doctor Who creating immersive historical settings. And if you don't think that sells it enough, just look at all those chickens. That's how you know it's Venice. Bellissimo. However, even during the establishment of this setting, the story runs into tonal problems. You have the plague inspector claiming the disease is running rampant outside the city, and that they're only being protected because of Rosanna. This should be a dramatic moment showing the unnatural isolationism of the city, being forced into a life of paranoia and fear despite the plague being long gone. That's a fantastic piece of background context that should be very dramatic, but the scene is instead played pantomime and for laughs.
According to this, I am your eunuch.
It again feels jarring, like Whithouse didn't know what he wanted the episode to be, so it constantly runs into these tonally unbalanced moments where it chooses comedy at all the wrong times. One of the few things I do like about Vampires of Venice is Rory, who is a great human core, even if he does get treated like an absolute goober for a lot of the runtime. He's a complete outsider to the Doctor and Amy's adventuring, so he's there to make understandably snarky remarks and criticise how dangerous the Doctor is.
It's not that you make people take risks, it's that you make them want to impress you.
It's always important to have characters making these kinds of observations, because the Doctor is dangerous to the people around them. It was a momentous part of Journey's End, showing how all these people have died for him. Just because the Doctor's regenerated, that doesn't make him any less dangerous to those around him. Unlike Amy, Rory doesn't hold him up to some high standard or put him onto a pedestal. He doesn't have that imaginary friend obsession with the Doctor. All he's seen is this stranger putting Amy in danger and apparently snogging her too. So it does make a lot of sense that Rory would hate the Doctor. But for all the good usage of Rory, the story also mishandles him by not treating his complaints as a sobering reality check they should be. He's there as the level-headed straight man, yet he's also the comic relief, a dorky coward who doesn't really contribute much to the wider narrative.
Yours is bigger than mine.
Let's not go there.
It's even more missed potential. Rather than giving Rory some credit or a backbone, he's relegated to being the butt of jokes and hating the heroic Doctor because jealousy. It's completely misguided in my opinion. You even have this horrific moment.
Why is him being your brother weird, but with me, it's okay?
I know you have to characterise Rory as a zero to make his transformation into a hero work, but the episode piles it on way too heavily and it feels almost spiteful and personal. And much like Rory pointed out, Amy comes down with a serious case of companionitis, volunteering to go into the Lion's Den undercover so that she can let in the Doctor and Rory through the trapdoor. It's a nice touch that the Doctor acknowledges this is how companions get killed, but it doesn't really end up being very relevant to the story. Even when Amy gets captured and bitten, it doesn't have any consequence. She just gets sonicked up and she's good to go. Now, I know gingers already get sunburnt easily, but you'd think there would be some kind of lasting effect on Amy, even if it gets mopped up at the end of the story. Hell, at least keep the puncture marks for more than a single scene. But no, much like everything else in this episode, things just happen and then they don't. It's annoying and actually makes things a bit boring because there's no consequence to the main characters. Whithouse even self-sabotages the scene of Amy getting bitten by turning it into a comedic moment.
Okay, I'll tell you. I'm from Ofsted.
Yeah, because this fish monster from outer space definitely knows this is a snarky joke. It's another comedic scene where there shouldn't be one. So you continue feeling this unbearable tonal inconsistency. The comedy is awful, just like this line.
Tell me the whole plan!
One day that'll work.
Well, luckily for you, Rosanna literally did. I find it very goofy that an episode with such a meta joke unironically does the exact thing it was trying to mock. And remember when I mentioned the whole sunlight stuff? Yeah, the vampire girls just show up at the house in broad daylight. Consistency? Who needs that when you have sex jokes?
Blimey, fish in space have never been so buxom.
I honestly never thought it was possible, but this episode is somehow hornier than one of Moffat's secret AO3 fanfictions. And when the episode finally decides to climax and free you from the torture, it unveils its ultimate city-ending threat. A giant storm cloud coming from a tower. Wow, at least you can say it was ahead of its time. Just chuck in a blue light and you've got every single superhero movie climax in the 2010s. It feels like a very generic and boring climactic battle, made even worse by a cringeworthy, unironic your mum joke. It also has the overused gimmick of the Doctor climbing up a tower with horrible CGI. It's not even like it's a trope that has worked well before. It always looks horrible, and it looks even more awful here. And I find it funny that the population reacts to the storm like it's the end of the world. I get it if the rain is pelting down at an unnatural rate for an extended period of time, but this is basically just a regular rainstorm in England, so everything feels hilariously small scale and overblown. And if the big beam in the sky isn't anticlimactic enough, you also have Rory fighting Francesca with a broom. Well, I say fighting, but he just kind of bumbles around until Amy saves him. So what was the point of this? The whole climax climax is atrocious, it just happens. The episode even tries to play this emotionally uplifting music to almost beg you to feel relieved that the monsters have been stopped, but it feels so hollow and bland. It's the calorie-free bun capping off the nothing burger that is this episode. It doesn't feel like some heroic and triumphant moment, so you feel like you've just wasted the last 44 minutes. Oh, and also Rosanna can't be in her fish form anymore, so she just jumps in the water and dies. I guess she didn't think to configure the perception filter to not fool her own race. There is some poetic irony in her dying to the same children she was desperately trying to protect, but the scene fails because of that lack of layers in the villain's plan. It's intended to be some dramatic moment as the Doctor fails to save Rosanna, but the episode had made sure you felt no sympathy for her. It shows a lot of naivety on Whithouse's behalf that this is supposed to be a weighted moment of the Doctor reflecting on yet another race being wiped out by his hand, because the groundwork was never there from the beginning. This moment would have worked perfectly if there had actually been a dilemma, but as it stands, the Doctor didn't even consider saving these fish when there was the opportunity much earlier. So why does he wait until the end to simply entertain the possibility? It feels wrong and completely misses the mark, serving as a really strange and misguided ending to Rosanna's presence in the story. The episode ends with Amy inviting Rory on board the TARDIS, a sharp contrast to school reunion back in series 2, where Mickey had to invite himself much to Rose's chagrin. It's a nice subversion because it continues the opening framing, proving that the Doctor was right to bring Rory along in this attempt to fix the relationship before it could fracture any further. He's learned from those mistakes with Rose, and it's a clear application of that knowledge here. However, the ending is ruined with the most baffling hint towards the series 5 story arc. For some strange reason, the entire area goes completely silent, which doesn't match up to the cracks in time since they erase things from existence. Nothing this episode contributes to that arc lines up with the rest of the storyline. By this point, the silence being erased hadn't been planned out yet, so it's weird that this episode acts like they are. For Rosanna's species to be wiped out by the cracks would also mean she wouldn't remember them ever existing, something established literally the week before this episode. Not adhering to that concept creates such a plot inconsistency, you just end up scratching your head. Venice itself falling silent feels like a dramatic plot hook that will come up again, but it never even gets mentioned again. So all in all, it's a very strange and unfulfilling ending that makes you wonder if there was some major miscommunication between Moffat and Whithouse that somehow never got corrected during the entire production cycle. I hate the Vampires of Venice. It's a really awful story. It's almost offensively bland and generic, with absolutely nothing setting it apart from any other episode of the time. It feels unambitious and more like an episode reluctantly made to fill a gap. There's a shocking lack of basic continuity all throughout, and it has major tonal whiplash, constantly switching between drama and comedy without setting on either, so it has a big identity crisis weighing it down. I will admit it's not unforgivable, there are some good parts about it. Rory is a solid supporting character, even if he's hampered by his nature as a comedic goofball, and the setting of Venice is realised well. The story does progress Amy and Rory's relationship in a somewhat satisfying way, sowing the seeds for their shared journey to come, but none of these things are enough to prop up such a weak episode. The side characters are uninteresting, the villain painted in two-dimensional broad strokes, and the Doctor is quite unsufferable with his actions and choices of words. Oh, and the story completely wastes the sexy vampire gimmick. I mean, come on, no 8-foot tall dommy vampire goth GFs? Instant F rank, 0 out of 10. But in all seriousness, I can't see Vampires of Venice achieving any higher than a D rank. It's a chore to sit through and it feels utterly pointless. Things just happen without any meaningful consequences, and the entire thing just feels like missed potential. There was so much this episode could have done right, but it somehow always makes the wrong decision at every turn, which is just wild. I think Vampires of Venice is one of those painfully forgettable stories you just completely overlook, and it definitely earns that status because there's pretty much nothing interesting about it. I may be showing my bias here, but even mediocre stories like The Idiot's Lantern feel more punchy and entertaining than this completely inedible nothing burger, and that's saying a lot. So if you know what's good for you, steer clear of Vampires of Venice. It's absolutely not worth your time. Just go read Lady D fanfics instead, it's much more fun. And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to my Diamond level patron Daniel Shillito, my Platinum patron Fallon Cortez, and all my Gold level patrons Alex Marston, Calvin, Franz Horn aka Line Vortex, George, Herna Verzog, and Stefan Never Miller. Thank you so much for your support.